Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, my name is Josh Rosen, a former Bangor City Councilor. I've been enjoying retirement from the council since 2016, and my specialty is in energy and climate law. Um, for the last for the last year or so, really since January of 2021, I've been working with the city of Bangor to prepare for climate action planning, not to actually begin the climate action planning, but kind of do the pre-preparation process, helping the city think about what climate action planning might mean. So my hope for today is I'm just going to give like I said, a few minutes overview of really one, how did we get here where we are today? Two, what is the process going to roughly look for the city of Bangor going forward? And then three, where we'll talk about next steps and where you might be able to go for more information if you're interested. So beginning with that first of how we got here. So really this year has been a very busy year for the city of Bangor with respect to climate. Back in spring 2021, the council passed a resolution that basically set us on this path. We identified some high level climate goals, as you see here in bold, of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 2050. And ultimately, how can we get the city onto a carbon neutral path by 2045? The goal of climate action planning is really to look at all municipal functions, from public works to city management to parks and rec and every other department there is. How can we think about all the municipal functions that the city plays, and how can we ensure that they're thinking about climate and operating in pro-climate ways? Importantly, how do we make sure that any climate action planning process is really comprehensive, that it reaches any community member, any citizen that's interested in engaging with this process? And ultimately, how can we use this plan to make Bangor a better place in the end, right? So it's not only about how do we hit our climate targets, but how do we think about community resiliency? How do we think about social issues and public health as we begin to plan around climate? So that was the resolution that passed in spring 2021. And since that time, the city of Bangor has been working with a number of neighboring communities, including the town of Orono, the BACS, the Bangor Area Comprehensive Transit System, the University of Maine, and some other partners to begin thinking about how we might plan for climate change together. So what started as the city of Bangor grew to include those entities, and I forgot to mention Hudson University as well, will be a major player in this process. And what that group has done, sort of a central project management team, was put together a request for proposals for a climate action planning consultant. And that RFP was published in January of this year. It's available for viewing on the BACS website. And I'll provide you with an area on the City of Bangor's website where you can go to view that RFP as well. That RFP really gives a super deep dive as to what the city will be looking at, the city and its partners, as it goes through this process, and also the role that consultants will play in helping the city prepare for climate change. So over the past few months, the review committee considered proposals. We got 4 really tremendous responses to the RFP from some national firms, including one organization called BSC Group and Linean Solutions. That was the consultant that the city of Portland and South Portland chose for their climate action planning process a few years ago. And Troy Moon from the city of Portland, as you heard, will be with us in just a few minutes to talk more about Portland and South Portland's process. So ultimately, the committee reviewed the 4 great proposals. We decided that BSC Group and Linean Solutions was most in line with what the project committee envisioned. And so we're actually beginning, I think tomorrow of this week, we have an internal project kickoff meeting with the consultants and with the project management team to begin to think about formally launching this program, including not just the technical aspects, but also the public engagement process. And we'll have more information later this month. So I've been alluding to process, right? So what does this process look like? Our climate action planning process, and really most processes throughout the country, follows sort of a 2-phase approach. And in the first phase, it's kind of about asking, where are we at today and what's most at risk? And so that's done through both a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and an infrastructure vulnerability assessment. And so these are both very highly technical analyses of municipal operations that will really collect some great data, see where we're at, see how we're doing. And then from there, we can begin to develop strategies, right? We'll have our sort of point zero. We have our climate goals that we talked about in the beginning. And how do we draw the line between those two? And that's what phase 1 will really help us think about. Phase 2, which is a much longer year-long to 18-month process, is really a planning and public engagement process. And so over that 12 to 18 month period, there'll be a steering committee that meets monthly, if not more frequently. There'll be significant volume of public engagement processes in Bangor, in Orono, joint between the communities. And really, it's not only just about how do we get the technical parts right, but how do we engage our community and our citizens to think about climate change and make sure that any plan that comes out of the city of Bangor or out of this regional plan has a good fit for the communities that it represents. So the plan will ultimately be focused around 4 major areas. They're listed here. Buildings and energy is one, transportation and land use, which I suspect is near and dear to your heart as a planning board, climate preparedness and community resilience, and lastly, water and waste management. The approach that we've outlined above is not only in line with sort of national trends, but we really wanted to align with the recent effort done by Portland and South Portland, which you'll hear about. And importantly, we want to build on the state's award-winning climate action plan, Maine Won't Wait. So I'll conclude with this slide. Importantly, that link at the bottom, bangormaine.gov/climate action. If you go to that page, you can see an overview of climate action planning. You can read the MOU that we signed between Bangor and the town of Orono. And you can also view that RFP that BACS issued earlier this year. Ultimately, our goal from the final plan is to really provide some good strategies based on where we are today and where we want to go and what do we need to do to get there. And importantly, how can we result in improvements, as I mentioned, in social equity, quality of life, and overall enhancing community resilience for our citizens. So I'm really excited to see this plan. Back when I was on the council, I was sort of one or a small member of a very small minority who said we should be thinking about climate, right? We should begin to process this. And so it's been a real treat over the last year to come back in a consultant capacity and begin to help the city think about this in a really serious and very meaningful way. So with that, I will bid you adieu and pass the mic to Troy. And also, if there are any questions in the meantime, happy to chat.
Basically, we started our climate action plan. We started our work in 2019. And we actually decided to work collaboratively with the city of South Portland. So we developed a joint climate action plan. So there's one climate action plan. Each of our city councils adopted it. And so we kind of like, I think maybe what you guys are thinking, that we would kind of combine forces and have economies of scale and share resources to hire the consultant to do our community outreach. And it made sense for us because both of our communities had the same goals regarding greenhouse gas reductions and also in terms of what our climate resilience goals are. And so because we're both different communities, we share the same goals, but we understand that because we're different and we have slightly different governments and different approaches, that some of our pathways to achieve our objectives might be a little bit different. So I'm going to speak specifically about the Portland context today. And I do certainly invite folks to join if you want to see our climate action plan, if you visit www.oneclimatefuture.org. That's our website. We have the climate action plan itself. We have our greenhouse gas inventory. We also completed a climate vulnerability assessment to inform the plan. That's there as well as a few other documents that certainly invite people to take a look at that and take a deeper dive into what we're going to talk about tonight. Our targets that were established by the City Council are very similar to the ones Josh mentioned that the City of Bangor has adopted. We're also shooting for an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We're shooting to run our city operations on 100% clean energy by 2040. And we also declared a climate emergency in 2020. And our commitment from that resolution from the council is to strive for carbon neutrality by 2030. And you can see in this picture here that climate emergency was largely spurred by activism from youth who came to City Hall several times in large numbers, and our city councilors responded by adopting the climate emergency. And so, you guys declared an emergency as well, so I think you understand the reasons we're doing this. Carbon emissions have been ramping up significantly, particularly since 1950. and we're still going in the wrong direction. So climate, we need to reduce our use of fossil fuels and reduce our carbon emissions, globally, and each community needs to do its part. Um, and it's interesting that the IPCC is asking for us to try to keep our global climate temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, and we can see that in parts of the world, even in Maine, that we're already facing temperatures that are already exceeding that. And in fact, Maine is one of the hot spots, so to speak. In Cumberland County, where Portland is, we've seen almost 2 degrees C increase since pre-industrial time already. So really, the sense of urgency is quite significant, and we really need to get moving. And Josh mentioned that part of your plan is going to be a lot of community outreach, and that was something that we took really seriously in our program as well. Again, this is where it was nice to have two cities working together because we were able to join forces and conduct a lot of outreach and engagement. In fact, we held almost 100 different events of some sort over the course of about 18 months. Everything from, we held community meetings, and we went anywhere people would have us to talk. We talked to different civic groups, neighborhood groups. We were on the radio talking about the plan with WGAN. We met with school groups. We had volunteers who also helped us. They would set up in the park. We trained volunteers to help us spread the message, basically. And all told, we had almost 100 different engagements. Really the point being that we really wanted this to be the community's plan, not the sustainability office's plan. We wanted to hear what people were thinking about climate action, what was important to them. So this process was immensely valuable to help the community buy into what we were trying to do. So certainly glad to hear that that's an approach you guys are going to be taking as well. And so there's several key elements to the plan. So buildings and energy use is one, transportation and land use. The second, waste reduction is key, and also community resilience. And so they all come together, they all work together to be part of an integrated whole. So we'll dive into some of the policies. I know that Josh mentioned that as the planning board, you're really concerned largely with some of the land use strategies. And so you can see this policy wedge of showing what are the impactful policies we need to do to reach our 80% reduction target. And solar, the big yellow stripe in the middle of the plan is actually Maine's renewable portfolio standard. So the state's committed to having 100% clean energy on the grid by 2050, 80% by 2030. So that's central. So we're really pushing electrification in Portland. We have a program currently called Electrify Everything. We're really encouraging everyone to ditch oil burners in their homes and adopt heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and electric vehicles in order to take advantage of that renewable energy portfolio, the renewable portfolio standard. But also land use is certainly going to play a huge part of it. We'll get into some of the details, but new construction, how are we building out the community to promote walkability and what we call complete neighborhoods. We want to build more solar in the city. We have a goal of 245 megawatts of solar in Portland and South Portland by 2050, and certainly mode shift. We want our objective is to really drive down the number of trips people are making in single passenger vehicles. Really promote transit, promote walking and biking. And Matt's going to kind of dive into some of the approaches there. But buildings are really important. We know that 60% of the carbon emissions from Portland and South Portland are from buildings. So it's really important that we make sure we build better buildings in the future. So this is an example of a housing development. Avesta Housing built this project in Portland several years ago. Passive house standard, doesn't have, it doesn't burn oil or gas. It runs on solar. So this is, we have the technology. Builders can make these types of buildings now. They're affordable to build, and they're much cheaper to operate in the long term. So we're totally pushing this. The city's adopted the state's voluntary energy code, the IECC 2021. We're excited to see what the next iteration of that code is. But we're really promoting energy efficiency in new buildings. And we need to make sure that we adopt policies that encourage more better buildings that will help us achieve our carbon goals. I mean, at this point, any buildings that are being constructed that are burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon are buildings that need to be retrofitted in the future. So we're trying to nip that in the bud, so to speak. And I mentioned the building solar, 245 megawatts of solar in Portland and South Portland. That means we need apartment buildings. The Jetport has a solar array currently. We have a solar array on our landfill. Homes have solar arrays. More of that for sure. We have, by ordinance, where we've created conditions, and we allow solar in every zone now by right. With some conditions in some cases, but we're really trying to promote solar and renewable energy in the city. Mode shift. I'm gonna let Matt jump in on this slide about some of our efforts around mode shift.
Sounds good. Thanks, Troy. Yeah, so picking up where Troy left off, so the next one here we have is mode shift. And this really, as Troy mentioned earlier, is just about getting people out of their single occupancy vehicles. So one kind of startling statistic that we came up with doing One Climate Future is that 87% of trips that happen in the city are via single occupancy vehicle. And so one of the stated goals of One Climate Future is to drop that down to about 60%. This is through encouraging walkability, bikeability, transit-oriented development, really anything, in complete neighborhoods. Again, having there be the infrastructure in place so that people can get to the things that they need in their everyday life without having to step foot in a car. And so this is something that, One Climate Future calls for, and something that we're looking to implement, going forward. Then you go to the next slide.
Yep.
And then this next one here is impervious surfaces. And looking at the city of Portland and looking at, past development precedent that we've seen here and elsewhere, you'll notice that there's substantial amounts of building area and parking lots and roadway infrastructure and sidewalks and lots of hardscape surfaces. And this is something that we identify as a major issue. We know that this leads to issues with stormwater management, that this exacerbates the urban heat island effect, given that that material radiates heat back out into the environment and ultimately changes the ecosystems and climate in our urban areas, across the country. And so this is another area where we are looking to reduce the overall amount of impervious surface within the city and within both Portland and South Portland by 15% by 2050. And then on the flip side of that is actually expanding our green infrastructure. So expanding for example, our tree canopy to extend more equitably across the entire city, and specifically in areas of the city that are most disadvantaged. So some of our lowest income areas are our neighborhoods with high percentages of people of color that live in those neighborhoods. So making sure that tree canopy is really distributed equitably.
Cool.
And then the last one here is building complete neighborhoods. We've referenced this a couple of times, but this is a central goal in both One Climate Future as well as in Portland's comprehensive plan, Portland's plan, which is that every neighborhood across the city of Portland should be a complete neighborhood. So this should be a place where you as an individual living in any given neighborhood should be able to walk out your front door and either walk or bike to any goods and services that you need to access in your typical daily life. So this could be food, this could be civic areas for civic engagement, schools, libraries, public open spaces, resources such as coffee shops or other kind of community engagement areas, and having that all at your fingertips without having to step foot in the car. And this is something that, again, was similarly called for in both of those long-range planning efforts. All right, so where I come in, and this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. So we've been talking about our climate action plan. This is a plan that was adopted back in 2020. That plan in and of itself, as you may be aware, doesn't necessarily immediately result in changes on the ground. So we, as the city, have been working to implement a lot of these land use strategies through our update to our land use code. So this is our city's Unified Development Code. We're in the midst of rewriting it for the first time in over 50 years. We've made minor adjustments and tweaks throughout time, but this is the first kind of comprehensive effort to systematically go through the code and make attempts at aligning individual regulations with these goals and policies. that the city has adopted. And so we are actually at this point about 75% of the way through that process. We have completed phase one of that work, which was mostly focused in on content reorganization and reformatting and making the document more usable and user-friendly and easy to administer. We've since hired a consultant to help us with this final stretch, which is actually taking a look at the existing content in the code and evaluating it to ensure that, to really identify areas where we are meeting the policies as they are adopted and where there are gaps. And so one thing I just wanted to highlight here is this work has been tremendously benefited from all of the groundwork that went into One Climate Future and went into our city's comprehensive plan, where there was this comprehensive community-driven vision for what we wanted to see in terms of climate action and in terms of comprehensive planning, and that those policy frameworks have really helped us to very smoothly adopt some of these regulations and changes. So we're, for example, on complete neighborhoods, looking to add new missing middle housing, add small scale commercial uses within residential zones, and then also map other small scale business zones in many locations across the city. On the transportation side of things, transit oriented development is well received, and there's been a lot of positive feedback on approaches that we've identified to create new transit nodes and really upzone areas where there is existing transit. And so we're really excited about this. We're looking to have the final version of this adopted, hopefully sometime here in about the next year or so. And then with that, I will turn it back over to Troy.
Yeah, I also want to mention, as part of the Recode effort, in phase one, it was largely cleaning up the text, but the council also took the opportunity in phase one to eliminate parking minimums a quarter mile, within a quarter mile of fixed route transit, which is basically 75% of Portland now. A developer can propose housing without parking, as long as they have some sort of some sort of management plan to address how people are going to move about. But it does not have to be parking. And also, the council authorized 2 accessory dwelling units in residential zones by right. So we're starting to see applications for ADUs in places we never saw them before, which is really exciting and helping accomplish that goal of adding some density off of the urban core of the city. And kind of in parallel to Recode, One Climate Future, we mentioned, climate resilience was a really important part of the plan as well. It called for what we're calling climate resilience overlay zones to govern how future development in the city would happen in ways that kind of incorporate climate science and what we expect the impacts of climate change to be on the city. So we're kind of imagining 3 different levels that would encompass the whole city. Tier 1 being parts of the city that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, particularly. So things along the waterfront or in Back Cove, or we actually have some parts of the city that are vulnerable to flooding from streams. So places that are most vulnerable would have to would have rules that would ensure that prioritize open space development that could deal with inundation, and then if we are going to do development, that it be something that doesn't endanger people and is built in a way that is able to accommodate being wet if we have storm surge or in the future of sea level rise, because we are expecting 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. So it's really starting to be an issue for us. Tier 2 would be parts of the city that are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge, but less so. Make sure that they're designing with resilient architecture and their sites can accommodate water. And finally, the rest of the city, because really the city needs to act as an organism. We don't want properties at the highest part of the peninsula to be draining stormwater down into the more vulnerable neighborhoods. So the idea is that all of these climate resilience overlay zones work together to build resiliency and to manage stormwater and to reduce urban heat island effects. And basically we have a kind of a comprehensive approach, and we're really just at the beginning of this. So we applied for a community resilience grant from the governor's office, as many communities did, and we were fortunately awarded $50,000, which we'll be spending on a consulting team to help us draft the language for these overlay zones that we'll bring forward to our planning board and ultimately to our city council, hopefully in a year or so. And finally, to implement our climate action plan, it really is collaboration. So I really enjoy working with Matt and the other folks in our planning department on, creating the policies that will, help us achieve those goals. But it's also, it's community. It's really a community effort. We really see our climate action plan is how do we make Portland, a beautiful, livable city that has opportunity for everyone in 2050 after we're really starting to feel the impacts of climate change. So we've always said that this plan really it's a people plan. We talk a lot about infrastructure and roads and solar panels, but really that's the ends to the means. And so we really need to keep that in mind as we start implementing it. What are we doing that's going to improve the quality of life for our residents in Portland, so we can continue to enjoy, what we, people live in Maine because it's a great place with amazing quality of life, and how do we make sure that that continues in the future? So, and that's what we have prepared, and Matt and I are both happy to answer any questions you might have.